Good morning, Meshach. It's Thursday, April 28th, and as some of you might recall, I am studying politics, philosophy, and economics. And part of the degree requirement for that at Denison is senior research. So over the past 10 weeks or so, I've been conducting research on feminism in India and China, and I want to share that research with you guys today. Partly because it's an interesting topic and I want more people to know about it, and partly because I'm using this video as my presentation for my senior research tomorrow. So if you're watching this there, hello everyone, this is a little bit strange. So let's just cut right to the chase. Okay, so the title of the project is The Makings of a Movement. And essentially I wanted to find out what we could learn from modern feminist movements in India and China. My central question is, how does environment impact the formation and results of a feminist movement? And admittedly, that question is a little bit vague, but intentionally so. I wanted to leave the door open to all sorts of different factors that might affect the formation of a feminist movement. For example, if a government is fascist versus communist, what impacts does that have? What about democratic versus communist? What impact does that have? Why this question? Well, it has implications for how we spread messages of equality. It also allows us to make predictions about what feminist movements are going to succeed, which ones are going to fail, and how they're going to form. And importantly, it broadens our understanding of what feminist movements can be. Great, we have a question. How can environment impact the formation and results of feminist movements? But we still need subjects to study, and I elected to study India and China. Why India and China? Well, there are lots of reasons, but some of the important ones are that they are in close geographical proximity to one another, they both have huge populations, they have both undergone giant political and economic changes in the past 30-40 years, and they have also undergone feminist movements during that same time. First, I wanted to understand what the environment for women was in India and China respectively. Next, I wanted to know what the modern feminist movements looked like in India and China. What were its origins? What were the modes by which people were trying to effect change? Have the pursuits been effective in politics, in the economy, or have they been failures? The last step of my process was trying to connect what I knew about the status of women in those countries and what I knew about the government, the economics of those countries, and combine it with what I knew about the feminist movements in both of those countries. Okay, great. We have our question, we have our subjects, and we have the process by which I tried to answer the question. Now, let's get to the meat of it. What did I discover? I'm going to start by discussing India, and then I'll start discussing China, and then I will discuss the feminist movements in both of those countries, and finally I will discuss what the main takeaways of my research are. I wish I had more time to discuss it because obviously these are giant countries with huge populations and I don't want to make broad generalizations, but for the sake of this presentation I'm going to have to focus in on a few specific things. So let's begin. What is the role of women in India and how is that kind of informed by the systems which are in place there? Well, the first thing that I found, and one of the biggest points that I discovered when researching India, was that Hinduism is very, very popular in India. And Hinduism actually has great foundations for feminist movements. And it repeats over and over in its main religious texts that men and women are essentially spiritually equal. Which is really important because Hinduism is ingrained in Indian society. Unfortunately, that notion that women and men were equal kind of degraded with time. Over the course of like 1,000 years, the status of women kind of slowly declined as Indian culture became more and more disconnected from Hinduism. Now, that being said, it's still the most popular religion in the country, and India is home to the vast majority of the Hindu population in the world. So, like I said, the importance of the female essence in Hinduism plays a big role on how women are viewed in India. Which brings us to our next important fact about India. It is a democracy. Now, that is important for a bunch of reasons. And one of the main reasons is that Indian women are super present in government. Part of the problem of doing the presentation this way is that I don't know how much time I have. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to China. Okay, another author's note here. An important thing to know about my research into China is that it was really, really hard. Chinese censorship, as it turns out, is a pretty big issue. So getting any information about feminism or just about news in China was way more difficult than it was finding information for India. Okay, when I discuss the treatment of women in China, a whole bunch of images probably jump into your mind really quickly. Images that look like this, or this, or this. And while those are all particularly gruesome examples of the mistreatment of women in China, they are not the largest issues for women in China right now, and they haven't been historically. Again, I'm going to be discussing two main points about China, and those two things are Confucianism and communism. For those of you who don't know, Confucianism is an Eastern philosophy founded by, you guessed it, Confucius, which said a bunch of cool things. It also said a bunch of less cool things. One of the most important takeaways from Confucianism is the idea of filial piety, or the idea of the importance of family, and in particular the importance of elders in the family. So you're supposed to respect your parents. Now you might be thinking, Sam, that doesn't sound too bad, and that's not too bad until you take into account some of the other stuff Confucius said. For example, the three obediences, sometimes translated as the three submissions, are three ways Confucius describes that women should submit themselves to men in their lives. And that's really important when paired with the idea of respect your elders. Essentially, Confucius is saying that an older woman ranks lower on the tier than does their own child, if he's a male. Which doesn't sound too important on its face, but it does have really important implications. For example, male were the primary property holders under Confucianism, which meant that in land-based economies, men were the only people that could create wealth. Now, communism espouses this kind of radical equality amongst all people, but unfortunately, China isn't really implementing like Marxist communism. But still, the role of government is really important in the role of women in China because, as discussed earlier, censorship, for example, is not great for women that want to speak out about bad conditions. But there are also upsides to communism for women. So what have we learned about India and China respectively? Well, India is democratic and has Hinduism. And what have we learned about China? Well, China has Confucianism, which is not great for women, and it also has communism, which is a little bit confusing for women. So let's talk about feminism in both of these places. In India, feminism has been largely legal. There are a plethora of different Supreme Court cases in India that have been very important for the liberation of women. I looked around quite a bit and I could find a few examples of, women taking to the streets in India, but unlike in the United States, that's really not how they do it over there. There weren't protests on the streets. There is kind of this presumption in India of women's equality to man, and it's enshrined in their constitution, and they know that, and things are still pretty new in India. Anytime there was an issue, they would just take it to the Supreme Court and demand that the government enforces the laws that are already on the books. But what about China? Okay, China is a little bit more confusing than India because it wasn't just through legal channels. As I said earlier, it's also a little bit harder to find out because there's more censorship on what's going on there. From what I could find out, it seems like they took two different strategies. One, a scholarly strategy, and two, a disruptive strategy. The scholarly strategy started with Li Zhaojiang, whose name I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, who brought women's studies to China. And essentially, she used Marxist philosophy and connected it to feminism and described three distinct waves of feminism. Unlike in India, in China, there are lots of examples of people taking to the streets, taking to social medias, and voicing their opinions, even in opposition to the government, which, if you ask me, is kind of awesome. Stick it to the man, feminists in China. Okay, great. So what have we learned? I'm going to summarize this by saying India's system had a favorable perspective on women. China's system had a less favorable perspective on women to start out with. And in India, women leaned into that existing favorable view of them and just wanted to get it on paper and wanted the government to enforce what they believed already existed. In China, on the other hand, where they didn't have that existing favorable view, they did two things to mitigate that or solve that problem for feminists. One is latch on to existing successful ideologies, and the other was to disrupt things. If you don't like the way that your group is being perceived, then you kind of disrupt the status quo and shake things up and demand to be seen differently. Okay, that about does it for my presentation. If you have questions or comments, leave them in the comment section or feel free to ask them to me now. Meshach, I will see you on Monday.